The first time the alarm went off at St. Michael's Hospital that winter. The hallway lights blinked and every door seemed to breathe. The sound was not loud, but it carried a cold certainty, like ice sliding off a roof at midnight. In room 714, a woman woke to it and did not panic. She stared at the strip of ceiling above her and said a simple prayer her grandmother had taught her in a different century. In a different house, Hail Mary, full of grace. She let the words be her breath because her lungs had learned to be unreliable. Her name was Claire Donovan, a high school English teacher from a suburb just outside Cleveland. She used to bike to school when the weather allowed it and host poetry nights in her classroom with a coffee maker balanced on a rolling cart. She loved the noise of teenagers, the drama of cafeteria promises, the click of locker doors, and the embarrassment of first drafts. Until this year. Until the coughing that lingered like an unwelcome relative. Until the blood test that did not smile back. Until the scans that glowed like a storm system. In the days since the diagnosis, her phone filled up with invitations to pray. An aunt promised a novena to Our Lady of Perpetual Help. A neighbor dropped off the parish prayer shawl, soft as a newborn's whisper. A former student mailed a handwritten letter that smelled faintly of cinnamon, reminding her of seniors who had once asked whether a character's suffering meant anything at all. Claire had always said yes. Now the question sat beside her four-pole and refused to leave. When the alarm stopped, a nurse named Matteo slipped into the room. His scrubs were decorated with small chevrons, and he wore a metal pinned just inside his collar, where only the hint of silver showed. Everything okay, Mrs. Donovan? It's Claire, she said. And I guess so. Are alarms like weather? We listen. And then the sun comes back? He smiled, checking the lines, the monitors, the winter blue light. Something like that. We practice to be calm when it matters. Do you need anything? I need to remember how to be brave without pretending I'm fine. He nodded once, with the quiet competence of people who stand between fear and its object. I can't help much with the pretending, but I can get you warm socks. And Father Patrick is making rounds this afternoon. He asked if he could stop by. The name floated across her like a pale kite. Father Patrick had baptized her daughter and had the kind of laugh you tried to catch. He had a coffee stain on the sleeve of his winter cassock and knew every child by name. He spoke the ordinary mysteries of Scripture with such plainness that you never felt accused. Only explained to. I would like that, Claire said. Matteo made a note and left behind a pair of socks with tiny anchors. She put them on and tried to sleep again. But the ceiling was a restless storyteller. It was almost Advent. The parish would be pulling out the wooden nativity with its chipped camel and the shepherd whose crook had been broken since 1989. Claire imagined the blue shawl over Mary's head, the plastic hay, the carved baby, the parish children leaning in and whispering as if the figure might turn and blink. Even in the hospital, she felt the memory of incense at the back of her throat. That afternoon Father Patrick arrived, shrugging off his coat with the awkward courtesy of men who have carried many casseroles. His hair had thinned and he walked slower now, but his eyes stayed quick, as if he were always looking for a joke God had hidden in the corner. Claire, he said, settling in a chair. I brought a little something. He placed a small statue of the Virgin on the windowsill, Mary's hands open and forward, a gesture like offering and receiving at once. She has stood on my desk since seminary. I thought she could keep you company for a bit. You're loaning me your Mary? Only till you're back in the choir loft arguing with Teresa about hymns. Claire studied the statue. It was worn smooth at the fingertips and had the faintest nick on the cheek, as if she had once fought a storm and kept walking. Father, Claire said, what do we do with pain that doesn't answer to reason? I keep thinking of my students, of all the essays about Macbeth and whether suffering makes us better or bitter. I joked then. I quoted theologians. Now my body is writing without me. He folded his hands as if tucking in a child. We tell God the truth, and we let Him tell it back to us with more mercy than we have. We are not called to pretend. We are called to endure and to accept help and to keep loving in pieces, day by day. You know we're about to bless the Advent wreath? I know, Claire said. 4 candles. 1 pink. 1 Gaudette Sunday. Joy in the middle of waiting. He chuckled. Your memory is better than mine. Do you want anointing of the sick today? It's not a goodbye. It's a strength for the climb we cannot see. She felt something loosen, then lift. Yes. He anointed her forehead and hands. The oil smelled like olives and old chapels, like the inside of a hymnal. He prayed in that careful way of priests who believe the words are the rope we climb. Claire closed her eyes and pictured a hillside. Mary's hands stretched out not in magic but in shelter. She felt the weight of a presence that did not remove the mountain but made a footpath. That night, while machines sang and the hallway clock argued with itself, Claire dreamed. It was not dramatic. She was sitting in the parish cry room, where the glass is thick and the sounds are muffled, and a young mother rocked a baby who would not stop. A woman stood beside her, patient and unhurried, not insisting on silence. The woman did not tell the baby to sleep. She whispered something like, "There is meaning even when you cannot see it. You are not a burden." When Claire woke, the room smelled faintly of roses the way old stories say it does. And if anyone had asked her whether she believed in such things, she would have answered honestly that she did not know. But she felt less alone. By the end of the week, the first round of chemotherapy had folded her in half. Her hair began to slip away in shy handfuls. Her daughter, Avery, came after school with homework and news about the basketball team's obsession with protein shakes and a new parish outreach project to assemble care packages for a domestic violence shelter. Avery talked fast, as if speed could keep time from noticing them. "Mom," she said, trying to smile without the wobble. "Can I show you something? Coach had us write down why we are thankful this year." I said I'm thankful for my team and for you and for Father Patrick's terrible jokes. And for St. Michael's because they're taking care of you. Claire laughed softly. Only a Christian would say thank you for a hospital. Coach says gratitude is not denial. Avery said. She says it's a way of telling the truth with hope. Coach is wise. Avery's phone lit up with messages. A cascade of hungry exclamations. She turned its screen down. The team is doing a fundraiser, she said. We're making bracelets with the word hope in different languages. We want to donate to St. Michael's so people without insurance can get medication. Our school board meeting last month was a war about whether we should do anything political. Some people said it's not our job to fix injustice. Coach said caring for the sick is not politics. It's the gospel. Claire felt something inside her warm and sit up. You know, she said, in my classes we always trip over that word justice. Teenagers either think it's a superhero's cape or a courtroom gavel. But sometimes justice is a nap delivered to a nurse who's worked 16 hours. Sometimes it's a bag of groceries slipped onto a porch without knocking. Or a bunch of teenagers making bracelets. Avery said. Exactly. The next Sunday, a winter storm stuttered across the lake. Claire watched the weather from her hospital window. St. Michael's was only 4 miles away, but the chapel felt like a different planet. The lights in the parking lot looked like toy stars, and she wondered whether the Advent wreath had been lit yet. Suddenly, the door opened, and a mother from the parish, Julie Chin, walked in like a practical miracle. Julie had organized the soup kitchen the way some people coordinate weddings. She placed a container on the side table and unfolded a clean napkin with the ceremony of a fine restaurant. Chicken and rice, Julie said. Approved by every grandmother I know. Remember when we taught second-grade catechism together and one of your students told me he thought the Holy Spirit was a pigeon because he had only seen pigeons? Peter, Claire said, smiling. He's probably in college now. Scaring theology professors. Julie adjusted Claire's pillow with the only kind of authority Claire could accept. Do you need me to call anyone? I need you to tell me something that isn't a platitude, Claire said. Something about God and suffering that might actually touch skin. Julie leaned back, thinking. Snow tapped the window like a polite neighbor. I once sat with a friend who was dying, she said finally. She told me people kept saying everything happens for a reason, as if God sent her disease like a coded message. She wanted to throw a chair. She said the only words that helped were the ones that admitted mystery and promised presence. So I sat there and said, I am here, and God is here, and we will not be clever. We will be faithful. In my dream, Claire said, surprising herself. Mary was in the cry room, just standing there with the baby and not insisting on quiet. She didn't fix the crying. She honored it. Julie nodded. That sounds like her. She does not erase our humanity. She makes room for it and then carries us in it. She lets suffering be transfigured without pretending it is pretty. When Julie left, the hallway buzzed again. The second alarm in a week blared. The staff moved quickly. A choreography that comes from repetition and fear being taught to behave. Later they learned that a patient down the hall had pressed the emergency button. Not for pain, but for panic. He had come in with injuries from a fight he had not started and would be billed for a life he could not afford. The system had offered him help in a dialect he did not trust, and the world outside had taught him to say no before anyone asked. He had finally said yes, then felt trapped inside his own gratitude. That night, Claire wrote in the notes app she had once used for grocery lists. She titled the entry simply Advent, and began to number the days with the discipline of someone trying to tell time out loud. Day 1, I am afraid of what I do not control. Day 2, pray without pretending. Day 3, ask someone to sit beside me for 30 minutes without checking a phone. She wrote out small acts of rebellion against despair. An inventory of hope. Her phone pinged again. This time it was a message from a former student, now a reporter for the local paper. His name was Marcus. He had once written an essay that began with a sentence so clean it had made Claire sit up. He wrote now to say he was working on a piece about the hospital's financial aid program and the local debate over whether the city council should allocate emergency funds for medical debt relief. He asked whether Claire would be willing to talk about what it felt like to be sick and covered, to be sick and cared for. She replied that she would try. He came the next day, careful and respectful. The way adults act when they are visiting their own childhood. He placed a recorder between them, but did not press it until she nodded. "What do you want people to know?" he asked. "That the dignity of the ill is not a charity project," Claire said. "It's a recognition that all of us are breakable. And that mercy looks like budgets and nurses and hot meals, not speeches." "Are you angry?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "But anger is not the whole story. It is the beginning of a sentence that must end with love or it will explode everything." Marcus looked at the small statue on the windowsill. "Is that Mary?" "It is," Claire said. "She's borrowed. My grandmother kept one on the stove. She called her Our Lady of the Simmering Pot. She said Mary teaches patience. Not the kind that sighs, but the kind that stirs. Stirring is holy," Claire said. Over the next weeks, the hospital became a parish in miniature. A janitor named Lorraine prayed the rosary while she mopped. A volunteer named Deshawn tuned the TV to the live stream of midnight mass and turned down the lights. The cafeteria served pierogi because it was Christmas Eve and someone had remembered a tradition from a grandmother who had been gone for 30 years. Avery brought a paper star painted gold and taped it to the window with the seriousness of an altar guild. Father Patrick came with communion and whispered the names of parishioners who were praying for Claire by name. Not as a list, but as a thread. He said he had heard confessions in the parking lot that week and one man had wept for 10 minutes before he could speak. He said forgiveness can be an earthquake with a quiet face. On the 4th Sunday of Advent, a blizzard knocked out power for half the city. The hospital's generators grew louder. A heartbeat under the walls. Nurses moved with headlamps, shining little circles of tenderness wherever they stepped. On the orthopedic floor, a man yelled, not from pain but from confusion, and a security guard shouted back before catching himself and turning his own voice into a blanket. In the emergency department, a teenager came in with a black eye and a bruise on her throat. A doctor wrote down everything carefully because carefulness is a kind of justice and a kind of love when the system can be made to behave. In the chapel, a group of staff and patients gathered in coats to sing O Come. O Come. Emmanuel with more conviction than pitch. Claire cried without embarrassment. She cried because sorrow had moved in and was paying rent. She cried because people were kind beyond their job descriptions. She cried because holiness felt less like perfection and more like hunger. And then the first infection came. It started with a fever that did not grunt a warning. It rose like a tide reaching places you cannot bolt down. By midnight, Claire was on oxygen and Mateo was calm and quick in the way that teaches others to be so. An attending physician named Dr. Patel read the chart while speaking to Claire like a peer. Claire's body shook with chills and memory. She thought of her grandmother kneeling by a bed with a worn rosary. She thought of Mary standing beside a manger in a drafty stable. Brave but not glamorized. A woman with sore feet and a heart already letting go. Sometime around 3 a.m, Claire felt the shape of surrender and it frightened her. She had always planned. She had orchestrated field trips and lesson plans and Easter brunches with color-coded post-it notes. She did not know how to let go without feeling like a failure. Yet the fever demanded a yes. Not the enthusiastic one of athletes and activists, but the quieter one of saints who know their bodies are dust and sacred. She blinked and saw, in her mind's basement, Mary again. Not on a cloud. Not with glittering garments, but in jeans and a blue sweater standing in the hallway. Her expression was not pity or pity's performance. It was steady attention. Like the gaze of a mother who holds you to the standard of your belovedness. I am here, Claire thought she heard. not as a voice but as substance. I do not waste tears. I do not ask you to pretend. Let me teach you to receive. When morning came, the fever eased, not because of a miracle, but because antibiotics did what they were designed to do. Claire slept finally, and when she woke, a new nurse sat near the foot of the bed. He had a tattoo of a sparrow on his wrist and a last name stitched on his badge, Gomez. He looked young enough to be a freshman, but his eyes had already had the education few survive without scars. My mom says Mary has calloused hands, he said without preamble. From holding the world. She said I should tell you that. Your mom sounds like a theologian, Claire whispered, the oxygen making her voice float. She runs a bakery, he said. But she reads saints like recipes. He adjusted the flow rate and checked the monitors, then sat back down. I know you don't know me, he said. But can I pray one Hail Mary? For your peace. For the other patients on this floor who are alone. And for my cousin, who was hurt last week in a fight he didn't start. He lives in a part of town where people think violence doesn't happen because they don't have to look at it. But it finds you. Compassion should. Too. Claire nodded. He bowed his head and prayed the old prayer that has crossed continents like a Canaanite woman looking for crumbs. He did not rush. The syllables wore working boots. After the new year, Claire's hair was mostly gone and her cells were quieter. She went home for a week between rounds. The house smelled like fir and cinnamon. Half of the lights on the tree already dim, as if the season had exhaled and was content to rest. In the living room, a neighbor had left a basket with soup and a laminated prayer card of Our Lady of Sorrows. Claire studied the image with a teacher's curiosity. Mary's heart was pierced, the old prophecy rendered in a color that refused to be dramatic. The card's text did not promise rescue from suffering. It promised companionship in it. Avery enrolled in a service elective at school, part of a new program the principal introduced after another neighborhood incident had made the news. A grocery store clerk assaulted for telling a man he had to pay. The speech that followed at the school board was fierce and divided. Some argued that talking to students about violence encouraged them to expect it. Others insisted that faith without works is not faith, and works require instruction. The elective's first unit covered trauma-informed care. Its second asked students to design interventions for food insecurity in their own zip code. Claire went to Mass on the first Sunday she was home. She wore a hat and sat near the back not to avoid people but to observe them. The choir sang too fast, as always, and she loved them for it. She stayed after to watch children run around the sanctuary and their parents try to bribe them with donuts. Father Patrick came down the aisle and hugged her carefully, the way you hold a gift that is fragile and heavy at once. During the homily he said, "Our waiting is not passive. Advent is a training in attention. To the poor. To our own hearts. To a God who arrives not as a thunderclap, but as a baby whose cries are a theology of presence. If you are waiting for a God who will yank you out of suffering like a magician, you may miss the God who sits beside your hospital bed and teaches you to breathe." After communion, a man who had recently lost his job stood up briefly and said he was starting a petition to urge the city council to fund the hospital's medical debt relief program. Someone else said they were organizing a vigil for a teenager who had been beaten walking home from the bus stop. A third person invited the congregation to a rosary walk through the neighborhood where the grocery store clerk had been assaulted. Not to make the news, but to bring attention to a corner that had been ignored by people with resources and decisions to make. The announcements did not feel like politics. They felt like a parish telling itself the truth in the language it had. Back at home, Claire sat at the dining table with a notebook. The window looked out on birch trees thin as patience. She wrote lines as if stacking kindling. My illness does not define me, but it shapes my days. Prayer is not an escape but a fire. Mary is not a rescue boat. She is the one who shows you how to row and when to rest. She wrote until the page smelled like pencil and possibility. The next round of treatment was controlled violence against her body. She submitted to it with the eerie discipline of people who step into storms because on the other side is a shore. She learned to ask for help with the clarity of the hungry. At night, she listened to mass settings on her phone. The Agnus Dei, a kind of lullaby. On bad days, she was angry and did not hide it from God. On good days, she saw beauty with an amplified frequency. When the volunteer pianist played a hymn off-key, Claire whispered a thank you because it sounded like bravery rather than performance. One afternoon, the hospital hosted a small interfaith service for patients and families. It was held in the atrium where a Christmas tree had stood, replaced now by a simple fountain. People of different ages and stories gathered. A fragile choir. A Muslim chaplain read a verse about God being closer than the jugular vein. A Jewish social worker spoke about Jacob wrestling with the angel through the night. Father Patrick prayed a litany for the sick that included both those with diagnoses and those whose suffering was invisible. At the end, the chaplains invited anyone who wished to come forward and light a candle for someone. Claire walked slowly. She lit 2 candles. One for herself. One for the teenager with the bruise on her throat. When she looked up, Mary's statue on the windowsill seemed to glow only because the sun had finally found it. A trick of winter light. Claire smiled at the trick. God was a better magician than she had given him credit for, but not the kind who yanked rabbits. The kind who transformed water into wine and people into themselves. As winter leaned toward Lent, the hospital calmed. The alarm still blared, but less like a storm and more like warning bells on a harbor. Part of the landscape. Claire's body adapted to drug cycles like a city learning a bus route. She noticed the small rituals that made survival feel like a sacrament. Mateo always asked if she had eaten. Julie always straightened the blankets as if she were setting an altar. Dr. Patel always ended their visits by asking a final question, not about symptoms, but about meaning. How is your spirit today? She would say. One evening, the elevator doors opened on the 7th floor to reveal a gathering. Nurses, aides, a volunteer from the parish, a custodian, and a few family members stood in a half-circle. Someone explained that a man down the hall had no family and would be transferred to hospice in the morning. He had asked, almost timidly, if anyone would pray with him tonight because loneliness is a burden even when pain medication is generous. The hospital staff, who had no time for such ceremonies, made time anyway. Claire stood at her doorway and watched as they prayed. Our Father. Hail Mary. Glory be. Simple as chalk lines. When they finished, someone started singing Amazing Grace. Not because it was perfect theology, but because everyone knew the words. The man cried. And it was the kind of crying that is also relief. After they dispersed, Claire lay back and felt fatigue settle like snow. She closed her eyes and saw again the parish cry room from her dream. The glass so thick it kept sound out but let the sight in. She saw Mary standing there. Not as a statue, but as a presence. Her hands still forward, offering and receiving. Claire whispered into the pillow. Thank you for not leaving. Thank you for not making it tidy. Thank you for turning my fear into a school. By spring, Claire had finished the full course of treatment. Her scans were undecided in the way human bodies often are. The doctors told her the truth because honesty is a kind of mercy. There were reasons to hope and reasons to remain careful. There would be more tests. There would be a calendar divided into assessments. There would be uncertainty. That word people hate, and that is in fact the ordinary air humans breathe. She returned to school part-time. The students stood taller when she entered the room, as if they needed to hold up the roof. She began a unit on hope in literature and assigned them essays asking for an argument that did not pretend the world was gentle. She let them choose between Flannery O'Connor and James Baldwin, between a psalm and a news article. She told them what she had told herself at 3 a.m. Anger must end in love, or it will become a weapon turned inward. One afternoon, a sophomore named Elias stayed behind. He was the kind of quiet you mistake for apathy until he speaks and hands you a lantern. Mrs. Donovan, he said, do you think suffering has a purpose? Not a cause. Not a reason to exist. But is there something it can do that nothing else can do? She looked out at the parking lot, the edges of snow blackened by grit. I think suffering is a poor teacher if you ask it to be the only instructor. But with love beside it, it can teach humility, which is not humiliation, and patience, which is not passivity. It can teach us to ask for help and to give it without condescension. It can make us tender. It can make us brave about telling the truth. And it can, if we let it, push us to resist injustice because we have felt the sting in our own skin. He nodded slowly. So suffering should never be romanticized, but it can be transfigured. Yes, she said. That's the word. At home that evening, Claire pulled out the small statue Father Patrick had loaned her months earlier. She had kept it clean with the care of a librarian for a rare book. She brought it to the parish office the next day. You can keep her, he said, half teasing. I have another statue who can watch over my stacks of bills. You need your original companion, she said. Besides, I think I have learned to see her without the statue now. She shows up when Avery laughs in the kitchen, when the nurse adjusts the blanket, when the choir goes sharp on the Gloria and forgives itself. He placed the statue on the bookshelf behind him, between a paperback catechism and a baseball signed by an altar server who had gone on to the minor leagues. You've taught us, too, he said. About transparency that isn't exhibition. About receiving help as an act of generosity because it lets us give. About how the body can be a sanctuary even when it is falling down. Claire shook her head. I'm just putting one foot in front of the other. That's the pilgrimage, he said. All the great saints did not fly. They walked. They got blisters. They asked for water from strangers. On Good Friday, Claire returned to church. The Passion was proclaimed with the old gravity. People knelt during the words that made the universe turn. In the pew behind her, a child whispered, "Why do they call it good?" And her mother whispered back, "Because the worst thing was not the last thing." Claire cried again. Not because she was sad, but because relief is a form of sorrow. 2. She touched the wood of the cross when the line came to her, and the wood felt like every hospital railing she had held. She prayed for the man with no family and for the teenager with the bruise and for her own body to be a temple even when it was an emergency. After the liturgy, The parish carried a cross out of the church and walked silently through the neighborhood, stopping on corners where bad things had happened recently. On the corner by the grocery store, they read the Beatitudes out loud. And someone added, "Blessed are those who refuse to pretend, for they will teach us to tell the truth. Blessed are those who agitate for mercy, for they will be called meddlers and saints." In the months that followed, Claire kept a small notebook. She called it her litany of ordinary courage. She wrote down names of nurses, janitors, doctors, volunteers, parishioners, teenagers, city council members, and her students. She included the reporter Marcus and the nurse Gomez and the janitor Lorraine and the neighbor Julie and the doctor Patel and the coach who made bracelets for Mercy. She wrote down when the city council voted to fund the medical debt relief pilot program by a narrow margin after a meeting that stretched past midnight. She wrote down that 2 members of the council insisted the vote had nothing to do with faith, and others said it had everything to do with the kind of city they wanted to be. And she recognized that both statements held a piece of the story. She wrote that Avery's team delivered care packages to the shelter, and one of the women there spoke about the quiet terror of violence that never makes the news. Claire wrote that the parish hosted a forum on domestic abuse, bringing in counselors who spoke about safety plans and legal options and the theology of dignity. Some parishioners were uncomfortable. Some insisted such topics were not for church halls. Father Patrick answered that the gospel is for kitchens and courts and shelters and hospital rooms and board meetings, or it is for nothing at all. Summer arrived with its easy arrogance. The doctors reviewed new scans and used cautious, but hopeful words. Claire listened and tried to let hope be a humble guest, not the host of a reckless party. She returned to school full-time in August. She noticed her students had grown 2 inches and a skepticism that had been earned by the news. She refined her unit on hope. She included a section on the difference between optimism and Christian hope, between false cheer and stubborn resurrection. On the feast of Our Lady of Sorrows, the parish gathered in the evening for a simple service. They prayed the 7 sorrows, each recited by someone whose life had bent around pain. A woman whose son was in prison read the first. A widower read the second. A nurse read the third. A high school student read the fourth. A refugee read the fifth. A man with a chronic illness read the sixth. Claire stood for the 7th, her voice steady and low. Afterwards, the congregation lingered in the parking lot, eating cookies someone had brought and talking about gardens and the parish festival. The statue of Mary outside the church looked out over them all. Her face was rendered in stone, but somehow it looked attentive. Claire walked over and placed her hand on the base of the statue. She did not ask for anything specific. She thanked God for teaching her that being held is not less than being healed. When she turned, she saw the world was the same and also very different. The lamplight was lamplight. The laughter was laughter. But she could feel the subtler physics of grace, as if gravity had decided to be kinder. Before she left, Father Patrick asked if she would write something for the parish website. "Tell the story," he said. "Tell it in a way that does not make people feel their own stories must be tidy to count. Tell them about alarms and socks with anchors and the cry room and the winter light on a windowsill. Tell them about the times you wanted to throw a chair and the times you almost did, and how God did not scold you but sat down on the floor beside you." She wrote it. She called it Our Lady of the Ordinary Alarms. She told the truth without clearing her throat. People read it in the grocery aisle and in waiting rooms. Some wrote to say they felt permission to stop pretending. Others argued in the comments that focusing on suffering was defeatist and that Christians should claim victory more aggressively. Someone said all this talk of justice was a distraction from prayer. Someone else said prayer without justice is sentimental. Another wrote that they had been assaulted in a place where safety was promised and did not know what to do with God now. Claire responded to as many as she could with the patience she had learned from machines at 3 in the morning. She did not offer slogans. She offered presence. She pointed to practical resources and to the schedule of confession and to the Tuesday night support group. She invited the parish to a rosary that would walk past the courthouse and the hospital, past the school and the shelter, not to wave banners, but to stitch together the places where grace must go to be true. Months later, in late autumn, Claire sat once more at her classroom window after school. The birches were already bare. The sky had that steel blue Ohio quality that promises snow but delivers dusk. She took out her notebook, the litany of ordinary courage, and added a line. Today I stood in the hallway outside room 214 and listened to 2 freshmen rehearse an argument for the debate team about healthcare access. One of them said mercy is expensive, and the other said so is cruelty. And I thought both were right and only one could be Christian. She closed the notebook and whispered a prayer for Mary to keep teaching her how to receive the world and give it back improved by tenderness. She looked at a photograph taped to the wall of Avery tying a bracelet with the word hope written in 3 languages. She thought of the hospital alarms and the Advent wreath and the vigil on the corner. She thought of the quiet voice the night of the fever. I do not waste tears. After dismissal, Claire walked out to the parking lot. The first flurries of the year came down without fanfare. She caught one on her glove and watched it vanish. She laughed. A sound that felt like a mass bell rung for recess. She got in the car and drove past the hospital, where the window of room 714 was dark now but not empty. It held the memory of a woman who had learned to pray without pretending, to resist injustice without hating, to carry suffering without letting it turn her into stone. And in a way she could not explain, she knew the story had a clear end because it had a clear beginning and middle, love. Not a sentimental word. The muscular, persistent, unglamorous love that shows up at 3 in the morning with warm socks and stays to hold your hand when you cannot pretend any longer. If you have read this far, you know the story is not only Claire's. It is ours. In every city where alarms go off and people choose either attention or indifference. I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. What do you believe about suffering that refuses to make sense? Where do you see violence and injustice wearing ordinary clothes? And what do you think Christians are called to do about it? Take a stance. Speak from your gut and your conscience. Tell us how mercy should look where you live. And tell us what you will do to help it take on flesh.